As part of Fáilte Ireland's suite of supports and resources on HR for reopening, this short video will give you an understanding of how to manage changes to working hours and arrangements. So, in today's agenda, we're going to cover business strategy and aligning your HR strategy accordingly. We're going to look at what are your options as an employer. We're going to look at the selection criteria for return to work. We're going to look at the phased return to work, and we're also going to look at the redundancy process. So let's get started. The first area to consider is the importance of identifying what is your business strategy going to be in the short and medium term and long term accordingly. Once you have reviewed and identified what your business strategy is, then we can align your HR strategy to that. But it's crucially important to make sure that you're aware that you can change your HR strategy as you go along. So, for example, if you bring back staff and the business levels don't meet your requirement, you have options to readdress that as you go along. So, let's look at your options accordingly. First, let's look at your temporary reduction in hours and the risks and how you might implement that. So, the temporary reduction in hours means that you might be in a position to bring staff back on different or staggered hours. So, for example, the staff member may previously have worked 3 days a week on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and now you need them potentially to work Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday in line with business requirements. It's important that you consult and negotiate with employees in relation to these changes of hours. It's also important that if you're looking at a temporary reduction in hours, how you identify the options in relation to that. Because a reduction in hours that doesn't meet the short term requirements means that that needs to be negotiated and agreed with your employees. So, number one, in terms of temporary reduction in relation to hours, it's important to consider what that might look like. Consult with your employees in relation to how that might impact them. Discuss how viable it is for them and what the business requirements are. And whatever you agree with the employee, communicate that in writing. Next, we're going to look at the wage reduction option and again how we might implement that and what are the risks. So, any wage reduction needs to be done with agreement of the employee. So, if you are doing it, normally we would do it for a period of time. So, for example, you might ask the employee to commit to a wage reduction that will be reviewed again in 6 months' time. If the employee accepts the wage reduction, you would confirm that in writing. If the employee refuses to accept the wage reduction, you can't enforce it, or if you do, there is a risk that the employee can take a claim to the WRC. Ideally, in this scenario, the employees will be very aware of the risk to the business of not cutting its cloth to measure, and they will do this on a communicative, collaborative way, and that there'll be a commitment to review it again in 6 months' time. Other options that are available to you is short time. And short time is a reduction in a full time staff member's hours to 3 days or less. If you are going to look at short time, again, you would consult with the employee. You would identify are there any other alternatives, and again, you would come up with a viable option that works with both you and the employee. Ultimately, though, as an employer, you can place the employee on short time, and ultimately they have to accept the short time because it's done in a correct process way. Other options are to look at layoff. So, again, you might continue layoff for certain roles for longer periods of time. Alternatively, you may bring the employees back. There may not be enough business, and you can readdress the option of potentially reducing their hours, putting them on short time, or laying them off again at a later stage. Obviously, our hope is that that won't be required, but again, it's important that you know what are the options available to you. Finally, just to clarify the difference between layoff and the employee wage subsidy. If a person is on layoff, that means that they're not available to the business to do training, projects, other work, etc. But if you have employees who are on the employee wage subsidy scheme and you're eligible accordingly for that, even if you're not topping it up, which you have been requested to do so if it's financially viable to do so, you can get the employee to do work while they're on the wage subsidy scheme. So that's just important to consider, particularly as we're looking at return. You might be getting them to help with SOPs, standard operating procedures. You might be getting them to do training, rosters, etc., and other types of work. So it's just important that you're aware of that. So the next thing we're going to look at is the return from layoff. And the important consideration is you must apply fair selection criteria that is reasonable and can be objectively justified in relation to choosing people for return. And there's a number of options available to you in that regard, especially if you're not bringing back all staff. Obviously, if you're bringing back everybody from layoff, you don't need to go through a selection criteria because you're not choosing one employee over another. So let's look at what those criteria are. So you might decide first in, first to return. Alternatively, you might decide that you treat each department differently. So, for example, reception department, you might say we need to do a skills matrix for that department because you may not need all the receptionists or can't have them all at the one location due to social distancing. So instead, you might say, well, look, we need the receptionist to have as many languages as possible, and we're going to use a selection criteria based on skills in that regard. And finally, you could do it based on department. So, for example, you might decide in relation to COVID-19, you're not going to bring back your laundry department and you're going to outsource that. So, again, you can treat each location or each department differently once you have objectively justified criteria. So, a mix or one of these may be the approach that you use, but it could be different, as I said, for different departments. But it's important you're aware of equality and unfair dismissals legislation, where an employee may say that they were unfairly treated, they were constructively dismissed, or equality was one of the grounds that was used. So, again, just tread carefully and make sure you keep your paper trail in that regard. It's also important to address refusal to return to work. So, if you have an employee who is refusing to return from layoff, it's important that you communicate with them in writing that the date the layoff will cease is X date, that they're expected to return to work. If they're not in a position to return at that stage, you need to then discuss what other alternatives are available. So they may be out on sick leave, they may be on unpaid leave, etc. So once you confirm the date of layoff finishing, you then need to start addressing the concerns thereafter. But the employee doesn't choose to remain on layoff. It's the business who decides have they work available to bring the person back from layoff. And that's something that has come up quite a bit in other sectors. So we expect that that may be a potential issue that you need to address also in this case. So, for many businesses, they're planning a soft phase return to work. And what that means is that they're planning the health and safety induction process would start. Then potentially they may be doing shorter weeks initially, again to facilitate social distancing, to potentially facilitate a team A and a team B, etc. And then they would be phased back to their full time hours. It's also important that we activate engagement and update staff members in relation to what that soft phase return is going to look like, when we think it's going to start, what it's going to involve, etc. And it's also important to incorporate wellbeing initiatives like Zoom tea breaks, like discussing how we're going to help people transition back to work because they've been out for such a long period of time, etc., when you're planning your phase return. So, the other considerations around your phased return are to do a virtual town hall, which means that the head of the department would talk to their individual teams and address any questions or concerns that they may have. Also, you would get the most senior person in the business to do a State of the Nation address and again update people in relation to the plan so that they have very positive, proactive information in relation to the plan, in relation to the return. It's also important to give appropriate notice. So the more notice you can give, the better. Make sure you communicate that both verbally, over Zoom calls, etc., Make sure you do a written follow-up, and email is best in that regard. And then, as I said, plan what team activities are going to happen in different departments, both work-wise and well-being initiatives, so that they understand the flow in relation to that. The next area we're going to consider is the area of redundancy. We're obviously hoping that this is a last resort and that businesses will not need to go down the road of redundancy. However, it's something that it's important that you're aware of your obligations and the risks in relation to redundancy. So we're going to go through that now. So the Redundancy Payment Act is in place, which outlines the employee's rights to notice of redundancy, redundancy pay, and paid time off to look for alternative employment or arrange for training. The risk associated with redundancy is twofold. One is that somebody would say they were unfairly selected for redundancy. So, for example, the person would say, look, I'm only being made redundant because my performance wasn't good. The job is required to be still done. It's to do with my performance. And that would be a legitimate ground for unfair dismissal or unfair selection for redundancy. There's also a risk in relation to equality, where again you may select somebody who is pregnant, who has underlying health conditions, etc., for redundancy. So we need to be conscious and careful that when we select people, we do that objectively justified to avoid the risk of equality. And it's crucially important to remember when we make somebody redundant, it's always the role we made redundant and never the person. So, for example, it is the role of the people who do the laundry, it is not the people who actually do it. So, it's always the job, it's never the person. So let's talk about how we select people for redundancy. So the important criteria needs to be objectively justified and it needs to be reasonable and applied in a fair manner. So there are generally three ways in terms of selecting people for redundancy. And generally they are last in, first out. So the employees who have least service would be made redundant first. Alternatively, you would put a selection matrix in place that will suit the specific department or roles that you are doing that redundancy selection for. And finally, it may be department specific. So you may have specific departments that are going to be closing because of the business strategy changing within the business. Once you have identified the redundancies going ahead, the first step is to start a consultation process. The better time to start it is as soon as possible, so the sooner the better. Failure to consult can result in an award of up to 4 weeks' wages or salary. And failure to comply with any other requirement under the Redundancy Acts may result in compensation of up to 2 years' wages or salary, or reinstatement or re engagement of that employee, which proves how important the paper trail is in this regard. During consultation, also, it's important to ask the employee whether they feel that there's opportunities for alternative work and allow the employee the time to present options to avoid redundancy of their role. It's important you consider that and take time to do so prior to moving on to the next stage. So let's look at collective redundancy. So, the Protection of Employment Act 1977 outlines obligations in relation to information and consultation by an employer where it is affecting a collective redundancy. And the numbers that are applicable depend on the size of your business. So, it is 5 employees where there are 21 to 49 employed. It is 10 employees where you have 50 to 99 employed. It is 10% of the employees where you have between 100 and 299, and where you have 30 employees or more when you have 300 employees in your business. So that means that if you have those numbers of people being made redundant, it triggers the collective redundancy process. This means that you have to give a written notice of the proposed redundancies to the Minister for Business, Enterprise and Innovation and copy the employees' representatives at least 30 days before the first dismissal or termination takes place. So let's look at what the redundancy payments are. The statutory payment is as follows. Each employee with 2 years continuous service is entitled to 2 weeks' salary for every year of service, plus 1 bonus week. The payment will depend on the hours of work and the gross salary. So, for example, for an employee with 10 years service, they would get 21 weeks payment in terms of their weekly salary. You may also decide to give the employee an ex gratia payment, and this may be subject to income tax depending on the amount given to the employee and their years of service. It is essential that they sign a waiver to confirm agreement to the terms of this ex gratia payment prior to this being paid. So, other considerations in relation to redundancy is if a layoff or a short time situation exists and has continued for 4 weeks or more, or for 6 weeks in the last 13 weeks, an employee ordinarily may give their employer notice in writing of their intention to claim redundancy. But under the new emergency measures in the public interest of the COVID-19 bill, this section of the bill has been paused until the 31st of the 5th, 2020. However, this is possible that this may be extended. So currently the redundancy payments is only invoked in relation to the employer who can invoke redundancy. The employee's ability to invoke a request for being made redundant is paused currently. So, other considerations are to make sure we understand individual circumstances, and that's the purpose of the consultation process. Also, during the consultation process, make sure you take your time. If it takes a little bit longer, that's a positive, so the employee feels they've been heard and they've got a full opportunity to consult. Also, be aware of the notice period that you're obliged to give the employee depending on their length of service. Finally, and most importantly, underpinning everything we do from a HR perspective with all employee dealings, make sure you have compassion and empathy in relation to how challenging and difficult this is for the employee in terms of potentially being at risk of being made redundant or indeed being made redundant. The FAQ to support this video is located here on the Fault Ireland website. I hope you found this video useful and thank you for watching.